Hi, I'm Andrew. I'm going to be talking about our work on evolving activation functions. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the judges for taking the time to look at our submission and for choosing us to be among the finalists. That was one of the most exciting emails I've ever gotten. So before talking about evolving activation functions, I want to talk about the larger field of neural architecture search. So why would you want to use neural architecture search? Well, I mean, we really don't have that many theoretical guidelines that tell us how to choose an architecture. For example, if we're dealing with images, then we expect that the optimal network is going to have some kind of weight sharing scheme among neurons. And we encode our inductive bias by using a convolutional neural network. So a convolutional filter is a kind of local weight sharing scheme. Um, but we don't know how many convolutional layers we should have. We don't know how many pooling layers we should have. We don't even know if we should have pooling layers. We don't know what the size of the convolutional filter should be, what about fully connected layers, and so on. And we really don't have any way of finding out manually other than trial and error. So we don't have a formula or anything like that. And that is just very annoying and very tedious. And so neural architecture search allows you to automate that. Reason number two why you would want to use neural architecture search, you don't just automate the process of designing an architecture and get equal or equivalent performance. A lot of the time you get better performance than anything that humans can manually design. And so from a practical point of view, if you can afford the computational budget required to do a neural architecture search, then you should probably do that. And the third reason why you'd want to use neural architecture search, and I think that is the most interesting one from a theoretical standpoint, is that by automating the search, you can find new interesting structures that you would not have thought of using if you were designing an architecture manually. So I think it took us an embarrassingly long time to understand that using connections that bypass a layer, like in a RevNet, allows you to train very deep neural networks efficiently. It seems like such an obvious thing to do, and I believe that if we had run bigger neural architecture search experiments with more degrees of flexibility, we would have found out about those types of connections a lot earlier. You look at modern deep learning, and you find out that evolutionary algorithms aren't really used anymore to tune the parameters of a neural network, except in reinforcement learning. So if you have a good estimate of the gradient, you probably want to make use of that. And you ask yourself, what is the role of evolutionary computing in modern deep learning? We very much believe that neural architecture search is going to end up being evolutionary computing's killer app. So we believe that the optimal way of choosing an architecture is going to end up being evolutionary neural architecture search. And after that, you can use any kind of learning algorithm that you want. If you think about it, that is well motivated biologically because evolution shows an optimal structure for the brain, but it doesn't play any role in learning the parameters of that structure. So we really do believe that any kind of work done in neural architecture search is going to end up being beneficial in the long run. Okay, on to activation functions now. So why would you want to evolve new activation functions? I mean, you already have these neural architecture search algorithms that will pick an activation function for you. They're just not going to evolve a completely new one. So they're going to pick an activation function out of a small predefined set. Well, I mean, the reasons why you would want to evolve new functions are exactly the reasons why you're using a neural architecture search algorithm in the first place. The hope is that by looking for completely new activation functions, you can get better performance, whether that is accuracy, a font measure, or anything else. And that is maybe the most practical reason for evolving new functions. The second maybe more interesting one from a theoretical standpoint is that we really don't understand the theory of deep learning all that much. So the mathematical theory of optimization that we have now talks about convex optimization, linear optimization, stuff like that. Whereas deep learning is very high dimensional, very non-convex optimization. And activation functions play such an important role in shaping the optimization landscape of the deep learning network. I mean, they're the reason why you even have nonlinearity. And the hope is that by finding new, unusual looking activation functions, maybe non-monotonic activation functions or something like that, you could learn something about the theory of deep learning. Motivated by these reasons, we set out to evolve new activation functions. We showed that you can encode the activation function as a tree and then use a simple genetic programming algorithm to look for new activation functions, and that is going to end up giving you an efficient search over the space of possible activation functions. Our work got accepted at GECCO 2020 and in the Transactions on Evolutionary Learning and Optimization, which is a wonderful new journal that talks about the interface between machine learning and evolutionary computation. Uh, we think it's a perfect fit for our work, and we're very happy that it got accepted there. So we did find a lot of functions that are better than the ones designed by humans, so better than the ReLU or the LeakyReLU. That is the reason why we're applying to this competition. We believe that from a practical standpoint, if you're already using an evolutionary neural architecture search algorithm, you should probably incorporate our algorithm into that. So it really doesn't add much to the computational time needed, and a lot of the time you get improved performance. You could make the case that the genetic programming algorithm is finding more complicated activation functions, and so it is indirectly adding to the computational time needed. But we don't think that finding complicated functions is a fundamental property of the genetic programming algorithm. So you could feasibly only use operations that are easy to do, like an addition or something. And we also believe that you can use a few heuristics to bias the genetic programming algorithm towards simpler activation functions, and we're actually working on that right now. We believe that we have the most diverse experimental study in the literature on evolving activation functions. We ran our experiments on 10 different data sets. Some of them are images, we have classification, we have regression problems. So we have a very diverse and I would say robust study. So one interesting thing we did is we looked at the properties of the activation functions that are being favored by the evolutionary algorithm, and we found that the best properties are problem dependent. And that implies that you're not going to be able to run away from using trial and error if you're designing an architecture by hand or choosing an activation function or something. We think that makes a good case for using an automated search. And lastly, we found that a lot of the functions that were performing well were very unusual. So they were not monotonic. They would change rather quickly. And as we discussed before, we believe that that is going to end up being very useful for understanding the theory of deep learning. In summary, we believe that evolutionary neural architecture search is going to end up being very important for deep learning. We made practical improvements to existing evolutionary neural architecture search algorithms by allowing them to look for completely new activation functions. And we believe that our work is going to end up inspiring multiple interesting theoretical questions. Thank you for listening, and thank you for hosting such a wonderful competition.